So the next thing we asked our classroom attendees was to identify some of the habits that they want to develop and some of the habits that they want to change so that we can use them during rest of the training. The next step was to use the worksheets that they were provided with during the session for making a plan of how to change the habits and how to start the new habits. These worksheets were all based on what we have already discussed in the training, based on the cue, routine, and the reward. I have copied the links of those worksheets just below this video, so you can access that and you can also use that if you are watching this video from your home. Alright, so in our discussion so far, we have seen 3 ways in which a new habit can be formed. One of the ways is to start from the very scratch. Look for new cues, new routines, and new rewards. And the example of that was in the Pepsodent story. So there was a new cue, film on the teeth, a new routine, brushing the teeth, and a new reward, that sensational feeling in their mouth. So you can start new habits just like that. Identify new cues, form new routines, and have new rewards for yourself. The second way of forming new habits is adding a routine onto an existing one. And that is the story of Febreze. Women who used to clean their house and then after performing that routine they used to have a sense of accomplishment or happiness. So what the guys at Febreze do, that they added another routine onto their existing routine. So that is what we can do as well, and we can also call this concept habit stacking. So we add one habit after another habit, or one routine after another routine. That can also be very beneficial, and I think that is the easiest way to develop a new habit. You already have a cue upon which you do certain routine, just complement or add that routine onto an existing routine, and that would make things much easier. We'll discuss more about it as we go along. The third way of forming a new habit is replacing an old routine with a new one. And the example of that is the Alcoholics Anonymous. So the people used to drink, that was their habit or routine, and they changed that routine with something beneficial. So they provided them with a social structure. Same cue, same reward, but the routine in between was changed. So that is another way of developing a new habit. But we have to keep in mind that it is not a magic stick, that we just put a few things on paper and then the magic would happen and our habits would get developed. It wouldn't happen that way. You will need to practice it again and again, and in the beginning you will need to use some of the willpower, and then it will finally get hardwired. Now, how to develop willpower, please hold on to that thing and we will discuss it in more detail. The whole section has been dedicated to it and we will cover it in more detail, inshallah. Alright, so this is a very important chart. So what does this chart tell us? It tells us that our habit formation depends on 2 things. One is the perceived utility, how beneficial we consider something to be, and the frequency with which we do that thing. Now first I'll explain 2 extreme cases and then we will discuss all what is in between. Now consider this line. Something is extremely high utility. You consider something to be of very high utility. So the perceived utility of that thing is extremely high. For example, survival. So what would happen? The frequency of that is very low. Like it's on this line. We're just talking about this line. So frequency over here is just next to 0. Very little frequency. But the perceived utility is so high that it would get into the habit zone. So habit zone is everything beyond this line. So if the perceived utility is very high, the thing would still get into the habit zone. Now consider the other extreme. We are now talking about this line. If something is done very, very frequently, despite its perceived utility is very low, just next to 0, but we have done it so much of the time, it would still fall into the habit zone. Once it crosses this threshold, it will fall into the habit zone. That is why some people have got habit of crushing their teeth or maybe just rubbing their head for no reason. Why? Because they have done it so frequently that it has become their habit. The perceived utility of that is low, but despite that, because of the high frequency, it crosses this threshold and go into the habit zone. And all the rest in between is basically a product of perceived utility and frequency. If the product of perceived utility and frequency falls here, it is not in the habit zone. It means that it's low perceived utility and low frequency, it won't form into a habit. For a habit to be formed, it has to cross this threshold, certain perceived utility and certain frequency, and it would then form into the habit, fall into your habit zone. So I hope this concept is clear. All these things basically sum up into the loop that we discussed. But in order to enable that loop, we have to have certain enablers. Now we will briefly discuss these enablers, but as we go along in the presentation, we will cover them in more detail. The first thing is why. If we don't understand why we want to develop a habit or why we want to change something, it is likely that we won't be able to do that. Or even if we are able to do that, we will leave it in a very short passage of time. So it is very important to have that anchor right. We need to know why we want to do something. Without this why being clear, we cannot develop any habit, or we cannot break any habit for good. Belief. The research also provides an evidence that belief plays an extremely critical role for any habit to change. This can either be a religious belief or it can also be a belief in yourself. In the case of Alcoholics Anonymous, we discussed that even the atheists used to get benefit from their routine and their approach because of the presence of belief in there. So the approach by AA used to create belief, and that was very much rooted in the religion. If you have got the belief right, science tells us and the research has proven that you are very likely to form or break habits as you like. The next bit is support structure. Hazrat Ali Hajberi, in his very famous book Kashf al-Mahjub, writes that whatever goes into the brain comes out of the brain. And whatever goes into the pot comes out of the pot. And our brain are like that pot. Whatever goes into it, whatever comes out of it is based on that. So, and as a child, what we get